For ca. 10 år siden så møtte jeg Jonathan Franzen på litteraturhuset for å snakke om Frihet, sånn rundt da den kom. Og det var et veldig hyggelig og tankevekkende møte. Og nå skal vi møtes igjen digitalt for å snakke om Korsveien. So just to start out, I mean, Crossroads, it's, as I mentioned briefly in my email, it's a type of novel that's thought-provoking in a way where you really just want to talk about it with people and discuss the content of it. But I think for a lot of Norwegian readers, it might be helpful to just start out with the simple aspects of what this is about. And we start out with Russ, who is a religious man, and he is at present, in the very opening, enamored with a young widow in the same sort of congregation. What brought you to sort of find this Russ character and start exploring him?
So this book began a number of years ago with a person I met and hung out with for a couple of days. I'll never see him again, but I was taken with him. I thought, oh, there's a character. And one of the things about him was that he came from a family of Mennonite ministers. And really the idea for a book came to me at the same single moment of really liking this guy and realizing I'd never written about religion, which connected with some thoughts I'd been having about mythologies in general, not just religious mythologies, but the kind of persistent mythologies even among non-believing people. I'd been encountering that in some of my climate writings and some of the controversy that arose from my climate writings, a sense that even though people are not religious, they still have dogmas, they still have stories of personal salvation. That all came together really in a single moment. And I decided to try to do a family novel, which I'd never done before, where many of the scenes are between actual members of the family, and that would follow this family over a number of generations. So that's a long way of saying I picked up the character I was interested in as a young man. I had to figure out who his father was. I figured he might come from a Mennonite family, but wouldn't be in a Mennonite family now because I don't really know enough about the Mennonites to do a whole novel set there. And so I put him in a church, and then I had to create some problems for the father. And I had to give him something he wanted. That's always key with a character. And I decided to make him want this young parishioner who is totally verboten, absolutely should not be pursuing her, but he can't help it.
It's a classic setup. And once you start with that, we're, I wouldn't say rapidly, but we are introduced to a number of characters. We meet Becky, we meet Clem, and Perry, who are the three older children, two of whom live at home, and Judson. And then eventually we meet the troubled Marion, who's his wife. And most of these people are believers. There's one who's a little bit on the fence, that would be Clem. But how did you work with that material and find their different forms of belief? Because they vary in their approach to Christianity and to the ideas that the church represents.
My approach was to essentially introduce God as a character in the book. We never hear from God ourselves as readers, but that God is someone with whom the various characters have a relationship and are in conversation with. So in a way, I always start with character, and my approach to faith was via character, and my own involvement in religious faith, which did not succeed in making me a believer, was narrative. I grew up hearing the Bible stories. I grew up reading the Bible stories, and those are powerful stories, both the Old Testament and the New Testament. There's a reason that great religions were founded on them. They're incredible stories. And so this was very much to my taste because I'm a storyteller and I work with character, and that was the way in for me.
One of the great things about this book, I don't want to reveal too much of the plot because it's so refreshing to just be like bathed in that drama as a reader. But one of the things that I really like about the setup that you have here is that we're in 1971, and this is a church, but it's also populated by hippiedom. There's some aspects of the 60s and early 70s that have sort of bled into the faith, and that creates a conflict between Russ and this other leader of the parish, Rick.
Right.
What's so refreshing is that when you read about the 60s and 70s or see a movie or, a TV show or whatever, there's usually like this checklist of all these things that you have to go through. And this particular type of church that isn't too crazy and too sectarian, but also not too hippie, isn't usually put at the center of something like this. Was that a goal for you to sort of move away from a lot of the cliches and tropes of writing about this period?
Yes. I mean, it wasn't an overriding goal, but I did not want to write a historical novel. I didn't want to produce a coffee table book about the 70s with coffee table images. I believe the word Nixon appears twice in the book, and in very minor ways. It's a bumper sticker on a mailbox, and so yeah, definitely, and that's because I'm not a big fan of historical fiction. Generally speaking, there are exceptions, and I didn't want to write about great people from the era. I didn't want to do that name-calling thing. I wanted to represent characters as they experienced life in 1971, 72. And when you're in an era, you're not thinking all the time about what become later the cultural touchstones of that era. You're just living your life. And so it came naturally to me, and I had the advantage of having been very much alive in 1971, 72, so that I didn't have to construct the world from without based on my reading of coffee table books. I could actually just put characters in a world that was deeply familiar to me.
And because in I was rereading The Discomfort Zone earlier this morning, and I came across the chapter that's about a church that resembles this to a large degree. So obviously you're building on some personal experience, but you also move quite a bit away from that. And I don't just mean geographically, but you create this whole world where this seems larger somehow than what you experienced. And I'm wondering, did you have to do a lot of sort of deep diving research into this type of group, or was it very easy to just sort of write it forth?
No, I was in a very liberal, rather hippie-ish youth fellowship for 6 years, so didn't. But I will say, I had done research. When I wrote that chapter of The Discomfort Zone 15 years ago, I had traveled around the country talking to alumni of that youth group. And God bless the younger me, I'd actually taken notes on all of that. So I had a couple hundred pages of notes from those conversations, so that when I needed a detail, like what are the kids doing on a Sunday night? They're doing these sensitivity training exercises. I found a list of 20 exercises that people remembered doing. So that, in a sense, the research was done, but I had done it 15 years ago, not thinking of any future for it.
The group that we're talking about, I was thinking about how, as I was reading it, when we're presented with religious groups, particularly maybe in news in the United States, it's often these huge evangelical groups or something like that have a political slant that's pretty clear. And then I came across a factoid that Jesus Christ Superstar is 50 years old. That was 1971 apparently when it premiered.
Right.
And I can remember I was born in '70, but I can remember this type of church being around. And I returned to Wisconsin recently, and it was pretty much that kind of thing didn't exist anymore.
No, it faded away. I think a lot of progressives were driven away from Christianity because it became associated with the evangelical wing, which had been cultivated by the Republican Party, and by the time, well, certainly by the 90s, Christian had become almost a dirty word on the left. Even though, if you go back to the 60s, those the people who were protesting the Vietnam War, the people who were marching for civil rights, those were congregations from liberal churches who were doing that, and that just disappeared, basically, just as you say.
Well, Russ is a character. He's directly connected to the civil rights movement. His church is involved in helping the Navajo on a reservation, and he comes, as you said, from a Mennonite group, and eventually ends up in the Forest Service during World War II. And there you're writing about another part of American history that I don't think a lot of people know about, and that's the World War II pacifists,
Right.
many of whom were Quakers and so forth. Why did you decide to anchor him there and then eventually move him into this other area in the '70s?
It's you start with these little tiny points that you feel that feel right, and then you try to connect the dots, basically. I was interested in Arizona. I knew that as a Mennonite, he would not have served in the Second World War. I knew he was politically active. He was involved in the anti-Vietnam protests. I knew all that, and I guess part of it is I just love the landscape of Arizona. I find Navajo culture fascinating. I find that land extraordinarily beautiful, and I wanted to set part of the book there. It's as simple as that, really. There was no master plan, and then the problem was, how do I get him to meet his future wife there? And things follow from essentially the arbitrary choice of Arizona as a locale for the book.
You just mentioned Marion, his wife, and I think I want to talk a little bit about that, because before she arrives in Arizona, she comes from a different background entirely. She's sort of a Northern Californian, initially quite well off, from a family with lots of money, and has a series of pretty cataclysmic personal experiences on her way to meeting Russ. Could you tell me a little bit about how Marion developed and what sort of character she is?
So in the first 4 chapters of the book, she's essentially invisible, and I didn't know who she was. The only idea I had was that she was trying to lose weight, as a lot of women in the early 70s were. That's where all the big diets and the diet aids come from, that era. And that was partly in response to all the divorces that were happening. Women were trying to keep their husbands interested in them, and part of that involved losing weight. That's all I knew about her. She wanted to keep her husband interested in him, and she was trying to lose weight. I tried to make that work. Each character I need to be able to articulate a dramatic goal or wish or desire for each character. And the more I looked at wants to keep her husband, the less I liked it. Especially since Russ has his good points, but he's also kind of terrible. And how do you sympathize with a woman who wants to stay married to a person who's kind of terrible? I just couldn't do it. So I had to find something else for her. And I think I just went back and started telling the story of her childhood in San Francisco. Again, lazy me. I know San Francisco. I know Northern California because I've been living here on and off, and now fully on for the last 20 plus years. and tried to just kind of followed her to see where she went, knowing another fact about her, which is that she has a troubled son. The third child, Perry, is not well in the head. He's self-medicating with drugs, which was super common in the early 70s. There were drugs in so many middle-class houses by then, and somewhere there crept in the idea that she herself had some mental illness in her family, her father and she herself, and I took it from there. But the thing is that at a certain point, the fact that she had been invisible to me, that I didn't know anything about her, that was leveraged into no one in her family knows anything about her. That the thing about her is that she has all these secrets because she'd had secrets from me. That's how I got on that real path of the extraordinary things that happened to her when she's a young woman.
When we finally see her sort of unpack her past, it's actually much of what you're talking about in San Francisco and eventually Los Angeles is she doesn't even tell her therapist about this. There are things in there that she doesn't share with this person next to a dentist's office that she goes to on the sly. But she also sort of unpacks her own psyche as she meets her children at various impasses throughout the book. And that's one of the most intriguing parts is we are sort of watching her develop as you probably watched her develop as a writer. She sort of opens up one aspect of herself, and with Perry particularly, after she, in frustration, grabs some cigarettes and so forth and starts smoking, finds some sort of connection with him, the young, troubled Perry.
And tries to warn him, there's trouble in this family I haven't told you about. You should know, and you need to be honest with me and tell me about yourself. The certain things in the story were determined by the fact that I'd chosen to set much of the story on a single day in December 1971. And it's not really very plausible that each of the 5 main characters is in the midst of a huge crisis on the same afternoon and evening. But it's a convention of drama. It's a convention of the novel. These things conceivably could happen. And Marion's sudden bursting out, her having admitted something to herself and her suddenly feeling liberated and exhilarated and really returned to this vital young self she had been and that she'd been suppressing for all these years. It was exactly what I needed to give some energy to a 400-page passage taking place on a single day.
Because that's another aspect of the book that doesn't necessarily have to do with faith or religion or their sort of worldview, but there's a lot of revisiting of episodes from the past where things sort of bubble up after 20, 30 years. And that gives it this interesting energy because you never really know when something else is going to sort of explode inside of these people.
Yeah, and I have a particular fondness for narrating backstory, for dropping out of the present into a narrative of a certain length that takes place many years earlier. I like those narratives because I don't have to proceed scene by scene. I can just tell a story and jump from critical point to critical point. It's part of a discovery I made many years ago, which is that in writing classes, the instruction is always show, don't tell. And I almost want to turn that around and say tell, don't show, because telling is much more focused and energetic, and it's rather laborious to keep having to show everything.
Well, the show don't tell sort of dichotomy makes me think of something else about this novel because it has a lot of similarities to your last three novels, Purity, Freedom, and The Corrections, in the sense that it focuses on a theme or two and uses them. It's a novel of plot, but it's also a novel of ideas and ideology and so forth. But in this case, I found it, in the other ones I can they're full of fully rounded characters, but I can sort of find, okay, here's what Jonathan Franzen is probably trying to say. I can sort of focus, okay, in the environmentalism aspects of Freedom, I think I know where he's going with that. In this one, I don't really know always where you're going with religion, and that's what keeps me constantly intrigued. Like, where is your idea about what faith should or can be? Was that freeing for you somehow, or is that more just a case of having done this a few times?
It's a good question. I feel that because this began as the first part of a long novel and turned into a novel on its own, and because I then decided to write two more novels related to this one, I felt I didn't actually have to come to any conclusions in the space of this book, that I could lay track both conceptually and in terms of the ideas, and definitely in terms of story, setting up later story, without having to go all the way down that track. I am up to something with religion, but I have not fully articulated it even to myself, and I still have supposedly two more books in which to nail that down for you.
We'll look forward to that. Because you mentioned the word mythologies, and that's the overarching thing. You have to remind me of the title for the whole series.
A Key to All Mythologies.
A Key to All Mythologies. So clearly you're developing some other mythologies as well, because Carl Jung pops up here and there in conversations with Rick. So there are some other things that will be fleshed out, I'm assuming.
Well, yes. I'm looking around the world today, and I see crazy things. I see the compatibility of evangelical religion with the phenomenon of Donald Trump. I see people invoking religion in refusing to get vaccines. On the left, I see a progressive ideology that derives straight from Jesus's ethical teachings without acknowledging that debt. I see an environmental movement that believes we can save the planet. This is talk of salvation, and also of inescapable human guilt. You hear a lot about that in the environmental movement. There are all these ways in which what was present in 71 has worked itself out as we approach possibly the end of the world here.
Because when you mentioned guilt here, and getting back to the novel, down from those large ideas, that and evil are very real concepts for these characters.
Particularly Marion. Yeah, particularly Marion.
But I'm thinking also of Perry, who exclaims at one point that he's evil at a party.
I think he says he's damned.
Damned, you're right. Sorry, that's correct. Yeah. And so they have this this sense that this is an actual real force in their lives, and they reach impasses where they have to move away from what they believe is wrong or evil. And even Clem, who's not much of a believer for much of the book, we haven't talked a lot about him, but he's searching for something that at least feels morally right.
He's a classic 20-year-old. He is a moral absolutist who has violently rejected the idea of a metaphysical God, but taken along everything else from his religious upbringing.
Could you talk a little bit about him and why you chose to develop him? We can reveal that he wants to join or he's been drafted, I guess it is, and wants to join the Vietnam conflict at a time when that's being ramped down.
Right.
What sort of person is Clem, and why did he intrigue you?
Clem was really the origin of the book. I feel I know who Clem is at the age of 70. So I know what Clem becomes, and this was an attempt to imagine what he would have been like at the age of 20. He's an intellectual with a very strong sense of right and wrong. He's in mortal combat with his father, trying to prove himself stronger than his father. Very age-typical things, all of these. And he doesn't know what to do about sex. It's so overwhelming for him. It threatens to just completely disable him. And we don't actually see that much of him. We see the least of him of any of the five main characters. And that's partly because I know at the back of my head, we're going to be seeing a lot more of him later. There is a very, very important fact, which is that he is kind of in love with his sister, certainly absolutely loyal to his sister. That was a key, for me, it was a very difficult thing to do, was to portray a relationship between siblings that is very, very intense, and without being icky, without having an incest component to it. So those are the main points about Clem. And yes, he is determined to prove a moral point to his father by making himself eligible for the draft.
And he, just to focus a little bit more on him and Becky before we sort of eventually close, I have a couple more questions I'd like to ask you. But Becky receives an inheritance from his sister that you were talking about, receives an inheritance from her aunt. And this amount is given to her because she was particularly nice to her aunt. But it also becomes a symbolic thing throughout the family because every single child has inherited some sort of ideology or way of thinking that they have to grapple with and somehow use. Becky is the one that we see have the clearest examples of religious experience. And she has visions of light and so forth. What intrigues me about her is that she seems so pure as this develops over time. It's almost as though she's too good for this family. And at the same time, she has this sentence that I had to just jot down, where she says, the Bible, to her brother Clem, the Bible doesn't tell us to like our neighbor because a person can't control who she likes. What sort of person is Becky, and where are we going with her?
Becky was a real problem for this book because when we meet her, she's the most popular girl in high school. She was a cheerleader, but decided the only thing better than being a cheerleader is somebody who quit being a cheerleader. That's so she's the queen of her high school class. She's said to be very pretty as well. And man, are you starting with 2 strikes against you as a novelist when you say someone is popular and pretty? It's very hard for me to sympathize with that person. And eventually, and she's accustomed to everyone thinking she's great. She's accustomed to being wanted. She feels great about how popular she is. And part of her religious awakening is recognizing, oh, but I'm terrible. I'm selfish. I'm vain. And that, when she reaches that point, I think she becomes more sympathetic, to me at least. And in a way, she needs religion more than anyone else does, because her life really has been all about her. And she gets this inheritance, and her father says, well, you should share it with your siblings. And she's like, that's not fair. I don't want to do that. She's not good. But she gets so much approval from everybody that it's very hard for her to reach the point of seeing that she's not good.
Just a few more questions to sort of sum this up at the end here. I was when we run through all these characters, it's as though they are constantly reaching these impasses, either with one another or with themselves, as they develop. And they're impasses that you can, trace to that part of the discomfort zone that we talked about, the chapter about your own experiences with this sort of group. But you've been very true to the division between the novel and autobiography, even though you can see that connection. As soon as I start reading this book, I know that this isn't Jonathan Franzen's direct experience of that place. In Norway, France, in the U.S. too, this autofiction is everywhere and has been for the past 10 years. Why do you... I think I know the answer to this, but I want to ask it anyway. Why do you still remain true to what you can reveal about experience through fiction?
Speaking for myself, my life is boring. And I'm a good enough writer that I can persuade you for some pages of an essay that it's interesting. I would note that my one autobiographical book, The Discomfort Zone, is very thin. And it contains pretty much every interesting thing that happened to me in my life. I've gone further and argued that life is so random and mundane that it's very hard for the facts about any person's life to get at the deep things that are going on inside the person. You need to invent. You need to draw in brighter, bolder colors, and you need to engineer profound conflicts, real impasses, because the stuff is going to stay buried unless you bring that additional energy of invention to it.
So when you say invention, it's our way of connecting more strongly with characters and what makes people tick, sort of. Is that what we're talking about here? Or?
Yeah, but also the example I like to give is Kafka's Metamorphosis. He made up a story about a person who wakes up and finds himself an insect. And I would say that was the better way for him to talk about what it was like to be living with his family when he was too old to be living with his family. If he had just described the facts, then it would have been, well, Dad said this and Mom said that, and oh, I felt this and I felt that. It doesn't get at how unbearable it was for him in that household. But have him turn into an insect, you get it immediately and you go really deep, and things happen that wouldn't happen in real life, but that reveal more than anything in real life could.
Well, I'm certainly grateful for this novel, Crossroads, and what it's opened up, and it's full of sort of unpackings of different ideas about what it means to be human in a way that's entertaining, and I'm happy for that. So,
thanks. I'm sorry we couldn't do this in person at the Literature House, but maybe next time around.
Yeah, next time around. Well, thanks so much for taking out time, and I hope it continues to rain in California.
Thank you, John Erik.
Take care.
Take care.